My sister tore off my wig at the altar to expose my cancer to 200 guests, while my mother laughed and called me a dying burden. They thought they had finally destroyed me on my wedding day. They had no idea they had just triggered a federal trap I spent 5 years building. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Allison, 33 years old, and I am standing at the altar of a sprawling Hamptons estate, staring into the eyes of the man I love. Bennett, 35 years old, held both of my hands in his own. The late afternoon sun caught the gold band he was about to slide onto my finger. 200 high society guests sat in perfectly aligned rows behind us, waiting in hushed anticipation. The string quartet had just faded into complete silence. The priest smiled warmly, asking Bennett to repeat his vows. It was supposed to be the most beautiful, perfect moment of my entire life. I had fought through 8 brutal months of chemotherapy for a rare form of leukemia just to be strong enough to stand here today. I felt a sharp tug on my veil. I assumed the ocean breeze had caught the delicate lace, but then a heavy hand clamped down on the back of my head. Before I could even turn around, my younger sister Chelsea yanked her arm backward with vicious force. The sound of tearing fabric ripped through the silent garden. A sudden rush of cold air hit my bare scalp. Chelsea had not just grabbed my veil, she had violently ripped off my custom medical wig, tossing it onto the manicured grass like a piece of trash. Gasps erupted from the crowd. 200 wealthy investors, tech executives, and society elites stared in absolute horror at my completely bald head. The pale, scarred skin of my scalp was fully exposed to the sunlight. I froze my breath, catching in my throat the humiliation burning my cheeks. I turned to look at Chelsea, who stood exactly one step behind me in her maid of honor dress. She was not horrified. She was smirking. Before anyone could intervene, the sharp screech of microphone feedback echoed across the lawn. My mother, Patricia, had stood up from her seat in the front row and grabbed the spare microphone meant for the wedding readings. She did not rush forward to cover me or comfort me. Instead, she laughed. A loud, echoing, theatrical laugh that paralyzed the entire venue. "Do not look so shocked," Bennett, my mother announced, her voice booming through the surround sound speakers. "You deserve to see what you are actually marrying. The groom deserves a real woman, not a defective, dying burden. Take a good look at her. Let him see what she really is." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the estate. The priest stepped back in shock. I looked at my mother, the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like a parasite. Patricia walked toward the center aisle, gesturing wildly toward my bald head. "She has always been a drain on this family," Patricia sneered, adjusting her designer pearls. "Just like when she ruined the Sweet 16 party for Chelsea by faking a severe asthma attack so she could steal the attention and force an ambulance to show up. She is doing the exact same thing now, playing the sick victim to trap a successful man. She is nothing but a parasite." The sheer malice in her voice confirmed everything I already knew about my family. They despised the fact that I, the family scapegoat, was marrying a successful cybersecurity executive. They hated that my career as a senior financial forensic investigator had made me completely independent of their toxic control. They had orchestrated this public ambush to break me, hoping Bennett would be so disgusted and embarrassed that he would walk away. I looked back at Bennett. My hands were shaking, my eyes welling with tears. I waited for the pity, the shock, or the humiliation to cross his face. Instead, his jaw clenched in pure anger directed entirely at my family. He did not let go of my hands. He stepped closer, wrapped his strong arms around me, and pulled me against his chest. Then Bennett did something that made the entire crowd break into spontaneous applause. He leaned down and pressed a long, tender kiss directly onto my bare, scarred scalp. "You are the most beautiful, resilient woman I have ever known," Bennett said, his voice steady and carrying enough volume for the front rows to hear. He picked up the discarded wig from the grass and handed it to the priest without a second glance. Then he turned his attention to my mother and sister. Bennett raised his hand and snapped his fingers twice. Instantly, 4 massive private security contractors in dark suits stepped out from the edges of the garden, moving swiftly down the aisle. Escort these two women off the property immediately, Bennett ordered, his voice echoing with absolute authority. If they resist, call the local police and press charges for assault and trespassing. The security guards closed in on Patricia and Chelsea. For the first time, panic flashed across my mother as a guard firmly gripped her arm. Chelsea saw her smug smile vanish, replaced by an ugly, contorted rage. She realized her plan to ruin my wedding had completely failed. Bennett did not care about the wig. The guests were disgusted by her, not by me. She lunged forward violently, snatching the spare microphone from the trembling hand of Patricia. "You can kick us out of this venue," Chelsea screamed into it. "But you both still owe us $250,000 for this entire expensive wedding right now." The sharp screech of the microphone had barely faded into the ocean breeze when heavy thudding footsteps echoed up the wooden steps of the altar. My father, Richard, did not come to apologize for his wife or his youngest daughter. His face was flushed a violent shade of crimson, a vein pulsing visibly at his temple. He marched straight past Bennett's security guards, who hesitated only because Bennett raised a single hand, signaling them to hold back. My father reached into the inner pocket of his tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick, folded stack of papers. He slammed them down onto the wooden podium right over the priest's ceremonial Bible. "Sign this right now," Richard demanded, his voice dropping into the low, menacing register he always used to terrify his employees, and for most of my life, me. "It is a promissory note attached to an itemized invoice. $250,000, Allison. That is exactly what you owe this family for the humiliation we have endured today and for the expenses we have covered to give you this wedding." I stared down at the document. The bold black letters at the top clearly read, "Promissory note and acknowledgement of debt." My eyes scanned the itemized list beneath it. It was completely absurd. He had billed me for Chelsea's custom maid of honor dress, Patricia's luxury hotel suite, a phantom catering deposit, and a massive line item labeled simply as emotional distress damages. They were trying to extort me at my own wedding, standing mere inches away from the man I was about to marry. "You want me to sign a debt agreement while standing at the altar?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. I did not shrink back. The scared little girl who used to crave her father's approval had died the moment the oncologist handed me my diagnosis 8 months ago. "You are going to sign it, or we are going to court," Richard threatened, leaning closer, so only the front rows could hear his vicious tone. "We gave you everything. We paid for the flowers, the food, the venue. We set up charity funds to keep you afloat when you were too sick to work. And this is how you repay us. By letting your tech boy here order his goons to manhandle your mother and sister. You are signing this debt over to Chelsea as an apology for ruining her day." I reached out and pushed the thick stack of papers right off the podium. They scattered across the white flower petals covering the floor. I did not break eye contact with him for a single second. "Just like you made me sign over my entire college trust fund to pay for Chelsea's failed modeling career in New York," I stated, projecting my voice so the surrounding guests heard every single syllable. My father's face twitched. The guests in the second row began whispering frantically. I was 18 years old. I continued, my tone sharp and piercing. I had just been accepted into a top-tier accounting program. "You cornered me in the kitchen and handed me a pen, telling me that Chelsea needed the $75,000 for a portfolio and a luxury apartment in Manhattan, because her beauty was an actual investment. You said my degree was a waste of money because I was too plain to ever make anything of myself. You forced me to take out crippling student loans while my sister spent my college fund on designer shoes and nightclub VIP tables, and when she came back broke 6 months later, you blamed me for not giving her more." "Keep your voice down," Richard hissed, looking nervously at the wealthy attendees, who were now openly staring at him with undisguised disgust. "You are making a scene. Business is business, Allison. Chelsea had immediate potential. You were just a nerd with a calculator." "That nerd with a calculator became a senior financial forensic investigator," I replied, stepping forward so I was toe-to-toe with the man who had tormented me for 3 decades. "I track missing money for a living, Richard. I hunt down corporate fraud. And I am telling you right now, I will not sign a single piece of paper you put in front of me ever again. You do not get to fund the golden child's lifestyle with my money anymore. Before my father could formulate another threat, a slow, mocking clap echoed from the front row. Donovan Chelsea's husband casually stepped out into the aisle. Donovan was a man who wore his power like a weapon. As a vice president of investments at a top-tier Wall Street firm, he was accustomed to crushing anyone who stood in his way. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit and walked up the steps to the altar, flashing a bright, arrogant smile that completely ignored the gravity of the situation. "Let us be reasonable here, Allison," Donovan said, his smooth, practiced corporate voice dripping with condescension. He placed a heavy, manicured hand on my father's shoulder, acting as the ultimate authority in the room. "You are letting your emotions get the better of you. Cancer is tough, we all know that. It messes with the hormones. But Richard is offering you a clean break. You sign the promissory note, agree to pay back the $250,000 you owe your family, and we can all walk away quietly." "I am not paying a dime, Donovan," I said, crossing my arms. Donovan sighed, shaking his head as if dealing with a stubborn toddler. He turned his gaze toward Bennett, sizing up my groom with a look of pure contempt. "You see, Bennett, in my world, we handle liabilities quickly. I manage billions of dollars in assets. My firm has a legal team that eats startups for breakfast. I know all about your little cybersecurity company. It is cute. You have a few decent government contracts, a nice little office park. But if Allison does not sign that paper right now to make my wife happy, I will make it my personal mission to crush you." The guests gasped. Donovan was openly threatening to destroy a company at a wedding altar. "I will tie your little tech startup in so much frivolous corporate litigation that you will be bankrupt before your first anniversary." Donovan promised, his smile widening into a predatory grin. "I will pull strings with my venture capital buddies to ensure you never get another round of funding. I will bleed you dry, Bennett, just to teach your new wife a lesson about respect. So I suggest you tell your bald bride to pick up that pen and sign the paper." Donovan crossed his arms, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He expected us to cower. He expected Bennett to panic and force me to capitulate. He expected total submission. But I just smiled, reaching down to smooth out the lace of my wedding dress. I did not feel fear. I felt the absolute intoxicating thrill of the trap snapping shut. Donovan looked around the altar, soaking in the stunned silence of the wealthy crowd. He truly believed he was the smartest, most dangerous man in the venue. He thought his Wall Street title gave him absolute immunity to treat us like dirt beneath his expensive leather shoes. My father stood right beside him, puffing out his chest, completely emboldened by his wealthy son-in-law's ruthless ultimatum. They stood shoulder to shoulder, two bullies who had spent their entire lives using money and intimidation to crush any resistance. I took a slow, deep breath of the crisp ocean air. The humiliation they had tried to inflict upon me had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. I looked at Donovan's smug face, then at my father's greedy, expectant eyes. They wanted $250,000. They wanted to maintain the illusion of their superiority. They wanted me to bow down just one last time. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had severely underestimated the nerd with a calculator. Donovan stood radiating arrogant confidence that only a Wall Street executive could muster. He expected me to start crying, snatch the pen, and sign my life away. He crossed his arms, a smug grin spreading across his face as he waited for my total surrender. Instead of breaking down, I simply smiled. I smoothed the intricate lace of my wedding dress. Bennett stood beside me like a fortress, his grip on my hand steady. "You are going to crush a federal cybersecurity contractor with your firm legal team?" I asked. "That is a bold strategy, Donovan. But before drafting imaginary lawsuits, we need to clear up an inconsistency regarding this invoice." I stepped forward, looking directly at my own father. Richard was sweating now, the midday sun catching the moisture forming on his forehead. I gestured toward the scattered papers on the grass. "You claim I owe you $250,000 for this venue, the catering, and the flowers," I said, making sure every guest could hear me. "You brought an itemized bill to my altar to publicly shame me into paying you back. There is just one massive problem with your performance today." I turned my gaze to the back and gave a slight nod. The estate manager, a woman named Valerie, stepped out from under the floral archway. She held a thick leather binder against her chest. I did not want to involve the staff. I continued, my voice ringing with absolute authority. But I am not going to stand here and be extorted by my own family. Valerie, could you please confirm the payment status of this event for my father? Valerie did not hesitate. She opened her binder and spoke clearly. The estate venue fee, the luxury catering package, the floral arrangements, and all staffing costs were paid in full 8 months ago. Miss Allison settled the entire balance in cash. There are no outstanding debts attached to this event. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. 200 guests shifted in their wooden chairs, murmuring in absolute shock. The socialites who golfed with my father and the investors who dined with Donovan were staring at my family. My father took a stumbling step backward. His face turned a sickly shade of gray. He looked down at the fake invoice, realizing his power play had just exposed him as a common con artist. "You are lying!" a shrill voice shrieked from the side aisle. Patricia lunged forward, her face contorted in a mask of desperate rage. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face, her voice echoing shrilly across the manicured lawn. "Do not listen to her," Patricia screamed to the crowd. "She is lying. She does not have that kind of cash. She has been drowning in medical debt for the past year. Chemotherapy bankrupts people. She is a broke, pathetic liar trying to embarrass her own father. We paid for this wedding because she is practically destitute." My mother panted, her chest heaving as she glared at me. She honestly thought invoking my cancer would earn her sympathy. She believed her words would turn the crowd against me. She was entirely wrong. I did not flinch. I let her words hang in the heavy air for a long moment, allowing the sheer cruelty of her statement to sink into the minds of every person watching. Then I took a step closer to her, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy calm. "You are right about one thing, Patricia," I said. "Chemotherapy is incredibly expensive. The treatments and the specialist consultations cost an absolute fortune. But I am a senior financial forensic investigator. I plan for emergencies. I paid every single one of my medical bills out of my own private savings. I never missed a payment, and I never asked you for a dime." My mother swallowed hard. Her confident posture began to crumble. She looked at Chelsea, who had suddenly gone completely rigid beside Donovan. "Which begs a rather massive question," I continued, my voice slicing through the garden like a newly sharpened blade. "If I paid for my own cancer treatments, and I paid for this entire wedding in cash, where exactly did the $400,000 go?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the birds in the surrounding trees seemed to have stopped singing. The wealthy guests exchanged horrified glances. "What are you talking about?" My father stammered, his voice cracking entirely. "I am talking about the GoFundMe campaign," I announced, turning to face the crowd of elite guests. 6 months ago, my mother and sister set up a charity relief fund in my name. They hosted gala dinners. They sent out mass emails to everyone sitting in these chairs today. They begged for donations to save my life, claiming I was drowning in debt. You all opened your checkbooks because you thought you were helping a dying woman. I turned back to my parents. They were trembling. Chelsea was staring at the ground, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. "They raised over $400,000 from your generosity," I told the crowd, before looking dead into my mother-panicked eyes. "I never saw a single penny of that money. I never even knew the fund existed until I audited my own public footprint 2 weeks ago. You stole from my community, using my tragedy as your personal piggy bank." Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out of it. She was hyperventilating, her eyes darting toward the exit. Richard looked like he was about to physically collapse onto the ground. The guests were completely enraged. Several prominent businessmen in the front rows were already pulling out their phones, furious that they had been scammed. I took one final step toward my mother, leaning in very close. "Did you really think it was a smart idea to commit federal wire fraud using the identity of a senior financial forensic investigator?" The utter silence that gripped the garden was shattered by my father's booming voice. Richard's face contorted into a mask of righteous fury, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. He was cornered, but men like my father do not retreat when cornered. They attack. He marched straight up the altar steps, his heavy footsteps echoing across the manicured lawn. Reaching into the inner breast pocket of his tailored tuxedo jacket, he yanked out a sharply folded piece of high-quality parchment paper. He thrust it directly into my face, his hands shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and rage. He turned his body slightly, ensuring the 200 wealthy investors could see the prop he was wielding. He needed an audience for his lies. "You have lost your absolute mind!" "Allison," Richard bellowed, pointing a thick finger at the paper. "You are standing at the altar of your own wedding, throwing wild, psychotic accusations at the family who kept you alive. Wire fraud, identity theft. You signed the withdrawal authorization for that charity fund yourself, and I have the physical proof right here." He waved the document in the air like a victorious gladiator. The murmurs in the crowd instantly shifted. A few of Donovan's Wall Street colleagues leaned forward, whispering to each other, their faces filled with renewed skepticism. My father sensed the subtle shift in the audience's energy and doubled down on his aggressive gaslighting. He stepped even closer, his voice dripping with condescension and fake paternal concern. "Chemotherapy takes a toll on the body," Richard announced to the crowd, adopting a mournful, sympathetic tone that made my stomach churn. "It causes memory loss. It causes confusion. My daughter is clearly suffering from severe cognitive decline. We transferred that $400,000 into a family escrow account because Allison explicitly asked us to manage her finances. She signed this legal release, giving me full authorization to distribute the GoFundMe donations to cover the massive debts her illness caused this family. Here is her signature, at the bottom of the page, clear as day." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or scramble to defend myself against his viciously spun narrative. As a senior financial forensic investigator, I knew that liars always bury themselves with their own fabricated evidence. I calmly reached out and took the document from his trembling hand. I smoothed the creased paper against the wooden podium. I scanned the dense legal jargon, skipping straight past the fraudulent escrow transfer details and bringing my eyes to the bottom right corner. There it was. A near-perfect forgery of my signature in blue ink. "A very convincing signature, Richard Fye," said, my voice projecting clearly over the microphone Bennett had seamlessly adjusted to point toward me. "You even managed to mimic the slight loop I put on the double L in Allison. You must have spent hours practicing that on scrap paper." My father sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. "I do not know what kind of delusional game you are playing, but that is your legal signature. You authorized the transfer of the funds to Chelsea and Donovan's escrow account. You gave that money away freely because you knew you owed us." "I want everyone here to pay very close attention to this document," I instructed, holding the paper up high for the front rows to see. "Specifically, I want you to look at the date printed right next to this flawless signature. October 14th of last year. This is a legally binding timestamp authorized by a notary public who I am guessing is a close personal friend of yours." I lowered the paper and locked eyes with my father. The smug satisfaction on his face fractured, replaced by the creeping realization of his catastrophic error. "Do you remember exactly where I was on October 14th, Dad?" I asked, dropping the volume of my voice so that it cut through the garden like a frozen blade. "Do you remember the phone call you received from the chief oncologist at Mount Sinai Hospital?" Patricia let out a sharp gasp from the front row, her hands flying to cover her mouth. She knew. She knew exactly what date I was talking about. "I did not sign this document on October 14th, I stated, turning my gaze to the horrified crowd. "On October 14th, my lungs completely failed due to a severe reaction to my second round of chemotherapy. I was rushed to the intensive care unit and placed on a ventilator. I spent 6 entire days in a medically induced coma. My organs were shutting down. The doctors told this man," I pointed directly at Richard, "to start making funeral arrangements because I was not going to survive the night." The silence in the venue was absolute. You could hear the faint sound of the ocean waves crashing against the cliffs in the distance. The wealthy guests stared at my parents with unadulterated disgust. "So please, Richard," continued my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy, Explain to the federal judge how a woman in a medically induced coma with a breathing tube shoved down her throat managed to sit up in her hospital bed, hold a blue ink pen, and sign away $400,000 of cancer relief funds to her perfectly healthy sister. My father's face drained of all color. He opened his mouth, but only a pathetic, raspy sound came out. The document slipped from his fingers, fluttering down onto the white flower petals covering the altar steps. He had nothing. His grand, aggressive gaslighting attempt had just provided me with the exact physical evidence of forgery I needed to put him in a federal penitentiary. Suddenly, a high-pitched scream shattered the quiet garden. Chelsea, my beautiful, perfectly groomed sister, completely lost her mind. The golden child could not handle the crushing weight of public humiliation. She realized the elite society crowd she so desperately wanted to impress was now looking at her like she was a monster. "Shut up! Just shut your mouth!" Chelsea shrieked, her face twisting into a furious, ugly grimace. She reached over to a nearby VIP table, grabbed a half-full crystal champagne flute, and hurled it directly at my head in a blind rage. Bennett moved with lightning speed, stepping in front of me and deflecting the heavy glass with his forearm. The crystal shattered against the wooden podium, showering the altar in champagne. Chelsea did not care. She stomped forward, pointing a manicured finger at me, tears of pure, selfish anger streaming down her face. "I deserved that money," Chelsea screamed at the top of her lungs, completely abandoning the fake charity narrative. "You were supposed to be dead anyway. Why should all those donations go to waste on a walking corpse when I have an actual future? I am pregnant. I am bringing a new life into this world, and I need a bigger house in the Hamptons. It is my right to take that money to provide for my baby, you selfish, ungrateful parasite." The crowd erupted in a chorus of shocked exclamations and horrified whispers. My sister had just publicly confessed to stealing cancer funds. She stood there chest heaving, waiting for anyone to validate her insane entitlement. But validation never came. Instead, the man standing directly beside her reacted in a way that made the blood freeze in my veins. Donovan, her powerful Wall Street husband who had just threatened to destroy Bennett's company minutes ago, slowly turned his head to look at his screaming wife. The arrogant, predatory smirk had entirely vanished from his face. His jaw was slack. His dark eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated shock. His confident posture crumbled as he stared at Chelsea's stomach, his face a terrifying mixture of confusion and sudden explosive rage. Donovan lunged forward and grabbed Chelsea by the upper arm. The grip was tight enough to make her gasp aloud, dropping the broken stem of the champagne flute she clutched. The crystal shattered into a dozen pieces on the steps, but the sharp sound was instantly drowned out by his booming, incredulous voice. Pregnant Donovan repeated the word, sounding like a curse on his tongue. "You are standing in front of 200 people claiming you need my money to buy a bigger house for a baby." Chelsea blinked hard, her furious expression melting into a mask of sudden panic. She tried to pull her arm away, but Donovan held firm. His expensive Italian leather shoes crunching over the glass as he stepped directly into her personal space. "Let go of me, Donovan," Chelsea stammered, looking nervously at the crowd of socialites and investors who were now hanging on their every word. "We can talk about the nursery and the house later. We need to focus on Allison stealing our money right now." "We are going to talk about it right now," Donovan snarled, his face mere inches from hers. "Because there is a biological impossibility regarding this miraculous child of yours. I had a secret vasectomy 2 years ago." A collective gasp, louder and more scandalized than any previous reaction, ripped through the manicured garden. Several guests in the front row actually stood up from their wooden chairs. Bennett tightened his arm around my waist, pulling me a fraction of an inch closer as we watched the impeccable facade of my family golden couple disintegrate in real time. Chelsea turned the color of ash. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land, but no sound emerged. She looked frantically around the altar, her eyes darting from Donovan to my father and finally to her mother, silently begging for a lifeline. Patricia could not let her golden child face the consequences of her actions. My mother rushed up the altar steps, her designer heels slipping slightly on the champagne-soaked wood. She physically wedged herself between Donovan and Chelsea, prying his angry fingers off her arm. "Donovan, you are overreacting!" Patricia shrilled her voice, pitching into a desperate, frantic register. "It is an IVF miracle." "Yes, that is exactly what it is. A medical miracle. Chelsea told me just last week that she was visiting a special clinic in Manhattan. You know these modern medical procedures, Donovan. Sometimes vasectomies fail or the clinic makes a miraculous breakthrough. You should be crying tears of joy that your beautiful wife is giving you an heir, not interrogating her like a common criminal in front of all our friends." Donovan stared at Patricia with a look of pure revulsion. The Wall Street executive who had just minutes ago threatened to bankrupt my husband was now being subjected to the most absurd, enabling gaslighting I had ever witnessed. Patricia was willing to completely destroy his dignity, publicly implying he was ignorant of basic human biology just to protect Chelsea from the glaringly obvious truth of her infidelity. It was a stunning display of parental delusion. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Patricia Donovan shouted, his voice echoing across the sprawling oceanfront estate. "I have had 3 distinct checks after surgery to confirm my absolute sterility. I am completely sterile. There is no miracle clinic. There is no failed medical procedure. The only thing happening here today is that your perfect spoiled daughter is pregnant by another man and trying to use it to extort her sister out of $400,000 so she can buy a vacation home." Richard finally found his voice, stepping forward to salvage whatever dignity the family had left. "Donovan, please, we handle family disputes privately. Do not cause a massive scene in front of my business associates and investors." "Your business associates just watched you commit federal wire fraud." Richard Donovan shot back, his face a mask of pure fury. He pointed a shaking finger at Chelsea, who was now hiding behind her mother and weeping genuine tears of panic. "I am divorcing you. I am calling my lawyers the second I leave this venue, and I am permanently cutting you off from every single joint account, credit card, and financial asset we share. You are going to be living on the street by tomorrow morning." Donovan turned on his heel, adjusting his custom suit jacket with a sharp, violent tug. He looked out at the sea of wealthy guests, many of whom were his own colleagues and top-tier investors, and gave a stiff, formal nod, attempting to salvage his professional dignity before storming down the aisle. He wanted to make a grand, dramatic exit, leaving my ruined family to deal with the fallout of their extortion scheme. He thought he was finally walking away scot-free. He took exactly 3 steps down the wooden altar stairs before a sharp, vibrating buzz interrupted the chaotic murmurs of the crowd. Donovan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He glanced at the screen, preparing to silence the device, but his thumb suddenly froze over the glass. His dark eyes widened. He stared at the screen, the angry red flush of his cheeks draining away until his skin was a sickly pale white. The phone vibrated again, then a third time. Then a continuous frantic series of loud alerts that sounded like a dozen fire alarms going off simultaneously. Donovan slowly raised his head. He did not look at Chelsea. He did not look at Patricia or Richard. He turned around, his leather shoes squeaking loudly on the champagne-soaked wood, and looked directly at me, his breathing shallow. The arrogant, predatory Wall Street shark was entirely gone. In his place stood a broken man whose empire was actively collapsing. His jaw dropped. He took a shaky step back. "What did you do to my accounts?" he whispered in pure, utter terror. Donovan's hand trembled violently as he stared at the glowing screen of his smartphone. The device buzzed again, emitting a sharp, relentless tone that cut through the ocean breeze. It was a message from his managing director. I could see the reflection of the text in his wide, panicked eyes. His perfectly styled hair seemed to lose its form as he stumbled backward, bumping into the wooden railing of the altar. "My accounts." Donovan choked out his voice, a frantic, shrieking wheeze that sounded nothing like the polished Wall Street executive who had just threatened to bankrupt my husband. "Every single one of my personal banking accounts. They are frozen. My corporate access is completely locked." He looked up from the screen, his chest heaving under his bespoke Italian suit. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He raised the phone to his ear, his fingers fumbling with the touchscreen. The silence in the garden was so absolute that we could all hear the tiny, tinny voice of his boss screaming through the receiver. The words federal authorities and immediate suspension echoed across the manicured lawn. Donovan dropped the phone. It hit the wooden deck with a dull thud, the screen shattering into a spiderweb of cracks. His eyes locked onto mine, burning with an unhinged feral desperation. The calculation was gone. The arrogance was gone. All that remained was raw, violent panic. "You!" Donovan roared, his face twisting into a mask of pure hatred. "What did you do to my money? What did you do to my firm?" He lunged forward, throwing his heavy frame up the final step of the altar directly toward me. He did not make it far. Bennett stepped in smoothly, his shoulder colliding with Donovan's chest with the force of a freight train. The impact sent Donovan crashing backward down the steps. He landed hard on the grass, his expensive suit tearing at the knee. Instantly, the 4 private security contractors closed in, forming an impenetrable wall of dark suits and broad shoulders between the disgraced executive and the altar. "Stand down." Bennett ordered, his voice radiating a calm, terrifying authority. "If you take one more step toward my wife, I will let them break your jaw." Donovan scrambled to his feet, ignoring the grass stains and the torn fabric. He pointed a trembling finger through the wall of security guards, spittle flying from his lips. "She hacked my accounts," he screamed to the crowd of wealthy investors. "She is a cyber criminal. She used her forensic credentials to illegally freeze my assets." I stepped around Bennett, placing a gentle hand on his arm to signal that I had this completely under control. I looked down at Donovan, who was panting like a cornered animal. I adjusted the delicate lace sleeves of my wedding dress, making sure my posture was flawless. "I did not hack anything, Donovan," I said, my voice projecting clearly to every single guest. "I simply did my job. Do you remember when my father so kindly reminded everyone that I was in a medically induced coma last October?" My father, Richard, flinched at the mention of his name, shrinking back into the crowd. "When I finally woke up in the intensive care unit," I continued, "I was weak, I was bald, I could barely breathe on my own, but my brain worked perfectly. While I was bedridden in that hospital for 6 weeks fighting through the agonizing aftermath of chemotherapy, I did not just rest. I worked. I had my laptop brought to my room, and I started looking very closely at the financial records of the man who married my sister. I took a step down, bringing myself closer to him. The security guards parted just enough to let me through. "You see, Donovan, your numbers never added up," I explained, speaking directly to him but ensuring the entire venue heard every syllable. "You flaunted a lifestyle that far exceeded your actual compensation package. The Hamptons rentals, the private jets, the sudden influx of cash into my father's failing business accounts. You thought you were untouchable. You thought a simple financial investigator could never untangle the web of offshore shell companies you created in the Cayman Islands." Donovan's face turned a sickening shade of gray. The color completely drained from his cheeks. Several of the wealthy investors in the second row, men who had trusted Donovan with their own portfolios, suddenly stood up. Their faces transformed from confused bystanders to furious victims. They began reaching for their phones, frantically checking their own financial portfolios. "I traced every single wire transfer," I announced, raising my voice to cut through the rising panic of his clients. "I followed the money from the legitimate corporate accounts straight into the dummy corporations you set up under Chelsea's maiden name. You were skimming millions off the top of your clients' portfolios to fund your extravagant life." "Shut up," Donovan hissed, looking wildly around the garden. "You have absolutely no proof. You are making this up to ruin me." "I do not need to make anything up at all," I replied, a cold, victorious smile touching my lips. "I spent 400 grueling hours in that hospital bed auditing every single transaction you made over the past 5 years. I mapped the entire criminal network. I documented the fake invoices, the phantom consulting fees, and the illegal corporate kickbacks." Donovan took another step backward, hitting the edge of a very large floral arrangement. His chest heaved. He looked at Chelsea, who was sobbing uncontrollably on the grass, completely ignoring her husband's catastrophic downfall. He was entirely alone. "I did not freeze your accounts, Donovan," I stated, delivering the final crushing blow with absolute precision. "I do not have that kind of unilateral legal authority, but the federal government does. The Securities and Exchange Commission froze your accounts this morning, based on the 300-page dossier I personally submitted detailing your massive embezzlement ring." The sheer terror on Donovan's face lasted for 3 seconds before his survival instincts kicked in. He let out a bark of laughter that cracked the tense silence. He straightened his spine, shrugging his jacket back into place, and puffed out his chest. He tried to project the impenetrable aura of a man who managed billions, but the cold sweat beading on his forehead betrayed him. "You are delusional, Allison." Donovan scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension as he addressed the stunned audience. "Do you honestly expect these people to believe a mid-level forensic investigator managed to topple a senior partner? My professional reputation is entirely spotless in this industry. I have passed every federal audit for the last decade. My clients trust me with their money. You are nothing but a bitter woman trying to ruin my wedding day with baseless defamation. I am going to sue you into absolute oblivion for this ridiculous stunt." I leaned into the microphone, my voice a deadly calm instrument that cut through his bluster. "Your pristine reputation was a carefully constructed mirage, Donovan. It only took me 3 days to find the cracks. I did not just audit your personal accounts. I audited the fraudulent Allison Cancer Fund. You know, the charity my sister set up to help pay for my medical treatments. The fake charity Patricia and Richard bragged about at every country club dinner to show everyone what a philanthropic family we are." Donovan froze. The fake amusement vanished from his face, replaced by a rigid, terrifying stillness. Chelsea stopped sobbing and looked up from the grass, her mascara running in dark streaks down her pale cheeks. "The $400,000 you stole from my GoFundMe donations was never the ultimate prize." I continued, my words hitting the crowd like physical blows. "That was just the seed money. You needed legitimate capital to open corporate banking accounts in the Cayman Islands without triggering international money laundering red flags. You used my name, my cancer diagnosis, and my impending death to establish a tax-exempt shell company. Once operational, you started washing the real money." I stepped out from behind the podium, walking slowly down the first wooden step, my eyes locked on the disgraced executive. $8 million, Donovan. That is the exact amount you siphoned out of your clients' portfolios over the last 18 months. You buried the missing capital in complex derivatives, generating artificial losses on paper, while funneling the actual cash into the Allison Cancer Fund, disguised as anonymous charitable donations. From there, it was a simple wire transfer, straight to your offshore accounts. It was a brilliant, virtually undetectable financial scheme, except for one massive flaw. I pointed a finger directly at Chelsea, who was clutching her stomach in pure horror. You needed a clean director to sign the offshore transfer authorizations. Someone with zero connection to your firm. Someone who would pass a basic background check. You made Chelsea the sole managing director of the Allison Cancer Fund. She signed every single wire transfer, sending that stolen $8 million to the Caymans, which means your entitled wife is not just an accessory. She is a primary co-conspirator in a federal money laundering syndicate. Total, absolute pandemonium erupted in the garden. The wealthy investors began shouting furiously. Men in tailored suits pushed past the floral arrangements, screaming at Donovan, demanding to know where their stolen money was. Women gasped, pulling away from my parents as if they were suddenly contagious. The elite social circle Richard and Patricia had spent their entire lives cultivating was turning on them like a pack of starving wolves. The pristine wedding venue had transformed into a crime scene. My father realized his entire empire, reputation, and freedom were actively evaporating into thin air. He could not gaslight his way out of federal charges. He could not bully the Securities and Exchange Commission. He was trapped, and his panic manifested as blind, explosive rage. "Shut up!" Richard roared, his face a terrifying dark shade of purple. "Just shut your mouth right now." He charged forward, moving with astonishing speed for a man his age. He bypassed Donovan and lunged directly for the altar, his hands outstretched like claws. He was not aiming for me. He was aiming for the audio system. He wanted to rip the microphone from the podium to silence the truth before I could speak again. He never even made it to the second wooden step. Bennett moved with lethal grace. He stepped seamlessly between me and my charging father, interposing his broad shoulders like a shield of solid granite. Richard threw a desperate wild punch, but Bennett merely sidestepped the attack. With effortless precision, Bennett grabbed Richard by the wrist, spun him around, and twisted his arm sharply up behind his back. Richard let out a sharp cry of pain, his knees buckling as Bennett forced him downward. The aggressive, domineering patriarch was instantly neutralized, pinned awkwardly against the wooden steps. The 4 private security guards immediately closed the perimeter, physically blocking the furious crowd from rushing the altar and tearing Donovan and Richard apart. "Let go of me," Richard wheezed, struggling uselessly against Bennett's iron grip. "I will destroy you for this. You are nothing. You hear me? Nothing." Bennett did not raise his voice. He did not blink. He leaned down, his face entirely devoid of emotion, and pressed his mouth directly next to my father's ear. The garden was loud with the shouts of angry investors, but I was standing close enough to hear what my husband whispered. "You are going to stand perfectly still," Richard Bennett whispered, his voice vibrating with a dark, terrifying promise. "Because if you cause my wife one more second of distress, I will hand the FBI the hidden ledger detailing what you did to your original business partner 10 years ago. Yes, I found the storage locker, and I know exactly where the body is buried." Bennett held the agonizing angle of my father's arm for 1 second longer, making sure the absolute dominance of the position sank into Richard's bones. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, Bennett released him. He shoved Richard forward, tossing him onto the manicured grass like a discarded piece of trash. Richard hit the ground hard. His custom-tailored tuxedo jacket rode up his back, exposing a sweat-soaked silk shirt. He scrambled his polished loafers, slipping on the damp grass, struggling to regain his footing. His chest heaved as he sucked in ragged gasps of air. Humiliation painted his face a mottled, furious red. For a man who had spent 40 years ruling boardrooms through intimidation, being physically overpowered and tossed aside in front of 200 elite guests was the ultimate degradation. He pointed a shaking finger at my husband. "I am going to sue you for everything you own." Richard spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of pain and rage. "That is aggravated assault. I have 200 witnesses. I will have you thrown in a federal penitentiary by midnight. You lay your hands on me again, and I will make sure your pathetic little startup is liquidated to pay my legal fees." Bennett did not flinch. Instead, a low, rumbling laugh escaped his chest. It was a cold, humorless sound that cut through the murmurs of the crowd. He adjusted his cuffs, his posture perfectly relaxed. "My pathetic little startup," Bennett repeated, rolling the words around in his mouth as if tasting something sour. "You really should have done your due diligence before you tried to ruin me, Richard. You spent the entire rehearsal dinner yesterday bragging to your golf buddies about how your daughter was marrying a tech nobody. You called my firm a garage operation. Did you ever actually bother to look up the name of my company?" Richard scowled, clutching his bruised shoulder. "I do not care about your garage company," "You should," Bennett countered smoothly, "because my little startup is called Aegis Defense Solutions. We do not make phone apps. We do not build websites. We are the primary private cybersecurity contractor for the United States Department of Justice. We build the digital infrastructure that the federal government uses to track domestic terrorism, international money laundering, and corporate embezzlement." The color drained from Richard's face so fast he looked as if he might faint. The angry, wealthy investors in the front rows suddenly fell silent. Donovan, who was still slumped near the bottom of the stairs, let out a choked, terrified gasp. "You invited the wolf right into your henhouse," Bennett said, stepping down to close the distance between himself and my father. "You thought I was just some tech geek you could intimidate into submission. You thought you could bankrupt my company to keep Allison quiet. But you do not have the clearance, the capital, or the intelligence to even scratch the surface of my firewalls." Bennett crossed his arms, staring down at the two men who had tried to destroy his wife. But the best part of this entire situation is your sheer breathtaking arrogance. You two consider yourselves criminal masterminds moving millions through offshore accounts exploiting a cancer charity. Yet you both fail at basic digital hygiene. Donovan scrambled backward on the grass, his eyes darting frantically toward the venue gates. "What did you do?" he stammered. "I set a trap." Bennett answered, his voice projecting clearly. "And you walked right into it. When you arrived at this venue yesterday afternoon for the wedding rehearsal, you both connected to the estate guest Wi-Fi. You did not even use a virtual private network. You just clicked accept on the terms and conditions without reading a single word. If you had bothered to read them, you would have seen that the network administrator had full authorization to monitor all data packets transmitted through the router." My father stared at Bennett in absolute horror. "You hacked our phones." "I mirrored them," Bennett corrected, his tone clinically precise. "The second your device is authenticated on my network, my software initiated a full background clone. I did not just get your banking apps. I got your encrypted messaging platforms. I got the deleted audio files between you and Donovan coordinating the escrow transfer. I got the digital footprint of every single fraudulent invoice you generated to cover your tracks. You handed me the murder weapon, the fingerprints, and the signed confession the moment you wanted free internet access. I bundled every byte of that data and appended it to Allison's forensic dossier. The Securities and Exchange Commission did not just freeze your accounts today, they seized your servers. The FBI is walking into your corporate headquarters in Manhattan right now." The total destruction of their criminal empire was complete. The crowd was paralyzed, digesting the staggering scale of the investigation unfolding before their eyes. But my mother, Patricia, had spent her entire adult life preserving the illusion of her perfect family. She could not accept defeat. She could not allow her country club friends to view her as the matriarch of a criminal syndicate. Seeing her husband humiliated on the lawn and her favorite daughter trembling in fear, Patricia launched her final desperate counterattack. She stepped out from the shadow of the floral arch, smoothing her expensive silk dress. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest, twisting her features into a mask of profound, agonizing maternal grief. She turned away from the altar and faced the crowd, directly, tears brimming in her eyes. "Please," she cried out, her voice quivering with perfectly calibrated sorrow. "Please, everyone, I am begging all of you. You must please forgive my daughter. Do not listen to a word she is saying. She is having a chemo-induced psychotic break. This is a severe medical hallucination. Her mind is failing her. The intensive radiation treatments have completely poisoned her brain. She needs immediate psychiatric care." Patricia scrambled away from the altar, abandoning my father and Chelsea to their respective panic. She practically threw herself toward the front row of VIP tables, targeting the wealthiest and most influential guests. Her performance was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. She dropped to her knees in front of Arthur Sterling, the billionaire hedge fund manager who held Donovan's largest accounts. She grabbed his forearm, her manicured fingers digging into his expensive suit jacket, and let out a heart-wrenching theatrical sob. "You have to understand, Arthur." Patricia pleaded, her face a perfect portrait of maternal devastation. "Allison has been terribly sick. The chemotherapy ravaged her body, and the radiation therapy practically melted her brain. She has been having these terrifying paranoid delusions for months. She thinks everyone is against her. She thinks the doctors are poisoning her. We have been trying to manage her mental decline privately to protect her dignity, but her mind is completely gone. She is a sick, dying girl, lashing out at the people keeping her alive. Please do not listen to this psychotic rambling." Arthur Sterling stared down at my mother, his expression a mixture of profound discomfort and creeping suspicion. He tried to pull his arm away, but Patricia held on with a desperate white-knuckled grip. "She needs to be committed," Patricia cried out to the surrounding tables, her voice carrying over the manicured lawn. "We are going to call an ambulance and get her the psychiatric help she desperately needs. My poor, deranged daughter does not know what she is saying. Donovan is a saint. Richard is a devoted father. You must ignore these insane hallucinations." I stood at the podium watching my mother leverage my actual agonizing brush with death to protect a criminal syndicate. She was attempting to use the very illness that nearly killed me as a weapon to discredit my sanity. A year ago, her public shaming would have broken me. I would have crumbled under the weight of her gaslighting, doubting my own reality to keep the family peace. But the woman who survived that intensive care unit was not the same woman who had desperately craved Patricia's approval. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with her frantic narrative. I simply turned my head toward the back of the garden, making direct eye contact with the audio-visual technician running the event production booth. I gave him a single sharp nod. Behind the altar, flanking the massive floral archway, stood two enormous LED screens. They had been installed at Chelsea's explicit demand, intended to loop a romantic, heavily edited slideshow of her and Donovan's lavish European engagement trip throughout the entire reception. The screens flickered, the soft ambient string quartet music playing through the venue speakers cut off with a sharp click. The sudden digital glare illuminated the faces of the shocked guests. The screens did not show Chelsea posing on a yacht in Monaco. They displayed crisp, high-resolution screenshots of private text messages and official banking statements. I tapped the microphone, ensuring my voice commanded the absolute attention of every person present. "You claim I am delusional, mother," I said, the words slicing through the tense air like ice. "So let us consult the definitive documented reality. Let us see exactly how devoted my family was while I was fighting for my life on a ventilator." On the left screen, a text message thread materialized. The names at the top of the chat were clearly visible in bold letters. Chelsea and Mom. The timestamp was dated from the exact week my lungs had failed. The font was magnified so largely that even the guests in the furthest rows could read every single word. I read the messages aloud, my voice steady, forcing the crowd to absorb the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of my own flesh and blood. "Chelsea writes to Patricia," I read, pointing at the glowing screen. "I cannot believe Allison refuses to die quickly. This is getting completely pathetic. She is just dragging this out for attention, and it is ruining my wedding planning schedule. If she does not pass by next week, I am going to have to cancel the cake tasting." A collective shudder ripped through the audience. Several women covered their mouths in horror. Arthur Sterling physically wrenched his arm out of Patricia's grip, stepping backward, as if my mother were suddenly covered in toxic waste. And Patricia replies, I continued, my eyes fixed on my mother, who was now frozen on the grass, staring at the screen in mute terror. "I know, darling, it is incredibly selfish of her, but look on the bright side. The GoFundMe account just crossed $300,000. We can transfer the funds on Tuesday and finalize the down payment on the Hamptons property. Just pretend to cry when the doctors call." The silence in the garden was absolute, broken only by the ocean waves crashing against the cliffs below. The elite society crowd, the people my parents worshipped their entire lives, were staring at Patricia and Chelsea with pure visceral disgust. "But we are not finished yet," I announced, signaling the technician again. The right screen transitioned to display a scanned bank statement. It was the official ledger for the Chemo Relief Fund, the charitable account set up supposedly to cover my life-saving treatments. Highlighted in bright yellow was a single massive transaction. Right next to that bank statement, a photograph appeared. It was a picture Chelsea had posted on her private social media account, posing happily in front of a sleek, brand-new vehicle. While I was undergoing my third round of aggressive radiation, I told the crowd, my voice echoing with righteous authority, my sister accessed the charity debit card. She did not use it to pay my oncology team. She did not use it to secure my hospital bed. She walked into a luxury dealership and swiped the card to purchase a $150,000 Porsche. The collective gasp from the wedding guests morphed into a deafening, furious uproar. These were not just socialites, they were chief executive officers, venture capitalists, and inherited wealth matriarchs who aggressively guarded their philanthropic reputations. Seeing the Porsche receipt right next to Chelsea's vile text message shattered the final illusion. These elite guests had written six-figure checks to the Allison Cancer Fund. They had attended the charity galas Patricia hosted, weeping over the touching speeches Richard gave about his dying daughter. Now the undeniable proof of their financial exploitation was 50 feet wide and glowing in high definition. At table 4, the Honorable Marcus Sterling, a prominent federal judge for the Southern District of New York, stood up. He did not yell, he did not gasp. His silent, cold fury was far more terrifying. Judge Sterling had personally championed Richard for a prestigious country club board seat just 3 months prior, vouching for his impeccable moral character. He slowly unbuttoned his suit jacket, his eyes locked on the screens, and pulled his cell phone from his breast pocket. The gravity of that single motion sent a ripple of absolute panic through the remaining VIP tables. When a sitting federal judge witnesses a multi-million-dollar charity fraud and dials his phone, the resulting shockwave levels empires. Patricia completely unraveled. Decades of meticulously cultivated grace vanished in an instant. She scrambled across the manicured lawn toward the glowing LED displays, her designer heels sinking into the mud. In a display of sheer pathetic desperation, she spread her arms wide, attempting to physically block the 50-foot screens with her body. She stood on her tiptoes, waving her arms frantically, screaming at the guests to look away. It was a grotesque, literal manifestation of her entire parenting strategy. She had always used her own body, her own reputation, and her own lies to obscure Chelsea's monstrous behavior. Chelsea, meanwhile, descended into a violent screeching and completely unhinged tantrum. Her perfectly tailored bridal gown was now stained with dirt and grass. She lunged toward the audio-visual booth, her face contorted in a mask of feral rage. "Turn it off!" Chelsea shrieked, her voice tearing at the seams. "Turn it off right now, or I will have you arrested." When the terrified technician ignored her, physically backing away from his console out of fear, Chelsea grabbed a towering floral centerpiece from the nearest table. Crystal shattered across the dance floor as she hurled the massive vase directly at the soundboard. The heavy glass smashed against the DJ booth, spraying water and shredded white roses everywhere, but the screens remained locked on her damning text messages. She quickly grabbed another centerpiece, launching it blindly into the crowd, screaming that her perfect day was ruined. This was the raw, unfiltered Chelsea. The same sister who used to destroy my science projects when we were children, knowing Patricia would immediately buy her a new toy to calm her down, while forcing me to apologize for upsetting her. Only this time there was no mother to sweep away the broken glass, and the audience was not a forgiving family therapist. Richard stood frozen in the center of the chaos, his breathing shallow and rapid. He watched Judge Sterling lift his phone to his ear. He watched his wealthiest investors, the men who held the lifeblood of his firm, in their hands, actively turning their backs and marching toward the valet station. The social and legal ruin was no longer a theoretical threat. It was an immediate, crushing reality unfolding in real time. The FBI raid Bennett mentioned was not a bluff. The offshore accounts were exposed. The fake charity was laid bare. His legacy was dead. The sheer terror in his eyes morphed into the cold, calculating cruelty of a cornered predator. He knew he could not stop the federal investigation, and he knew he could not save Donovan, but he still had one card left to play. Bennett had briefly turned his attention to intercepting Chelsea as she lunged for another crystal vase. In that singular fraction of a second, Richard moved. He darted forward, his large hand snapping shut around my upper arm like a steel vise. His grip was punishing, his nails digging hard enough into my flesh to leave deep bruises. Before I could cry out, he yanked me violently to the side, dragging me several feet away from the podium into the shadow of a massive oak tree. The sheer force of his pull nearly took me off my feet. He backed me against the rough bark, his face inches from mine. His breath smelled of stale scotch and raw panic. He ignored the screaming crowd, ignored his ruined wife, and ignored his hysterical golden child. "You listen to me, you ungrateful little wretch!" Richard whispered, his voice a venomous, frantic hiss that bypassed the microphone. "You are going to walk right back up to that podium and tell everyone Bennett hacked those servers and fabricated those documents to extort us. You will say he forged the wire transfers." I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. "You are insane," I breathed. "The DOJ already has the original files." Richard leaned closer, his eyes wild and completely unhinged. "You will create reasonable doubt right now, or I swear to God, Allison, I will make the call. I will release the medical records we kept from your original diagnosis. The ones detailing the experimental non-approved narcotics you begged your doctors for when the pain got too bad. The ones that prove you were illegally purchasing restricted opioids while handling sensitive federal forensic cases. I paid a lot of money to keep that addiction quiet to save your career. Do you honestly think your pristine forensic firm will keep you when they find out their star auditor is a documented criminal junkie? Fix this problem right now, or I will gladly burn your entire life to the ground with mine. Richard tightened his fingers around my bicep, his nails biting my skin through the fabric. He was panting, his chest heaving with terror and adrenaline. The sounds of the ruined wedding reception faded into the background. I could hear Chelsea screaming near the DJ booth, and furious investors demanding answers. But right here in the shadows of the old oak tree, the world narrowed to my father's panicked, bloodshot eyes. He gave my arm a violent shake, demanding my complete attention. "Shut the screens off right now," Richard commanded, his voice a ragged, desperate whisper. "Tell everyone this is an elaborate prank and clear my name. Do it, and I will not leak your medical files to your employer to get you fired. I will bury the evidence of your opioid addiction. I will let you keep your perfect career. But if you refuse, I will make sure you never work in forensic accounting again. I will make you destitute." I stared at the man who sired me, feeling absolutely nothing but profound, chilling disgust. There was no fear left in my body. For 30 years, this man had dictated my reality, using fear, financial control, and emotional blackmail. He had conditioned me to believe my survival depended entirely on his good graces. But standing under that tree, looking at his sweating face, I realized he was nothing more than a pathetic, cornered coward. He had zero power over me. "You really are a one-trick pony, Richard," I replied, my voice steady and cold. I yanked my arm downward, breaking his grip with a sharp motion. I stepped back, smoothing the fabric of my sleeve where his fingers had dug in. "You stand here threatening to ruin my career, forgetting we have already played this exact game." Richard blinked, temporarily thrown off balance by my lack of submission. "Did you really think I forgot what happened when I was 25? I asked, stepping closer to him, forcing him to back up against the bark of the tree. I had just secured my first junior partnership at the firm. I was finally making real money, establishing my independence. You hated it. You hated that I no longer needed your allowance, and you hated that I refused to sign off on those questionable tax returns for your shell companies. So you tried to destroy me." His eyes darted away for a fraction of a second, the universal tell of a liar caught in the spotlight. "I never did any such thing," he muttered, though the conviction had drained from his voice. "You called my managing director directly," I stated, enunciating every syllable with lethal precision. "You set up a private lunch with him under the guise of a concerned father. You sat across from my boss and told him I was mentally unstable. You claimed I was prone to psychotic breaks and nervous breakdowns. You actively tried to convince my firm that I was a liability who could not be trusted with sensitive financial data, all because I would not participate in your fraudulent accounting schemes. You tried to get me fired so I would come crawling back for financial support." Richard swallowed, a bead of sweat tracing a line down his temple. That was different. He tried to argue, his voice losing its threatening edge and descending into a pathetic whine. "I was protecting the family business. You were young and naive. I was trying to teach you how the real world operates. You taught me that my own father would sabotage my livelihood to maintain control," I countered. "But your little stunt failed back then, and your blackmail is going to fail right now. Do you honestly think I hid my medical treatments from my employer? When my lungs failed, my firm paid for my extended medical leave. When the pain became unbearable, I went to my human resources department, submitted my medical files, and took a legally protected leave of absence to safely manage my prescribed pain medication under the strict supervision of an addiction specialist. I did the work. I went through the withdrawals. I came out clean. My employer knows everything, Richard. They supported me through the absolute darkest period of my life. Your blackmail material is entirely worthless." Richard stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The realization that his final, desperate piece of leverage was completely useless washed over him. His shoulders slumped and the domineering posture he had maintained for decades finally collapsed. "Please, Allison." Richard begged, his voice cracking as he abandoned anger for pure pleading. "You cannot do this to me. I am your father. I will go to federal prison. They will take everything I have built. Just tell them the screens are a prank. I will give you anything you want. I will give you half my estate. Just shut down the presentation." I smiled. It was a slow, deliberate smile that made my father recoil. I reached up with my right hand and gently tapped the center of the heavy, luminous pearl necklace resting against my collarbone. "Did you forget Bennett's line of work?" I asked softly. Richard frowned, his eyes dropping to the jewelry. "What does your husband have to do with this?" I tapped the largest pearl a second time. "Aegis Defense Solutions does not just specialize in network security and data retrieval. They also manufacture top-tier military-grade surveillance equipment." The blood drained from my father's face as understanding finally dawned on him. "You are wearing a hot microphone," I whispered, my smile widening as his absolute ruin cemented itself in his eyes. "Every single word of your desperate, filthy extortion attempt, including your confession about trying to sabotage my career and your offer to bribe me with half your estate, just broadcast live over the venue's speakers to 200 guests, 3 federal judges, and a very interested FBI agent who just arrived at the front gate." Richard froze, his hand still hovering in the air where he had previously gripped my arm. His eyes darted from the pearl necklace resting against my collarbone to the massive speakers strategically positioned around the perimeter of the garden. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat as the reality of my words began to penetrate his panic. He opened his mouth to speak, likely to formulate another threat, or perhaps a pathetic denial, but he never got the chance. I raised my hand and signaled the audio-visual technician in the booth. The young man who had been terrified by Chelsea just moments ago now sat up perfectly straight and slammed his hand down on the main playback console. The ambient noise of the garden instantly vanished, replaced by a sharp burst of audio static that echoed through the high-fidelity surround sound system. Then my father's voice boomed across the manicured lawn. It was not the polished, charismatic tone he used during country club fundraisers or board meetings. It was the raw, vicious hiss of a cornered predator. "Tell everyone this is an elaborate prank and clear my name." The recorded voice of Richard snarled the audio perfectly crisp and undeniably authentic. "Do it, and I will not leak your medical files to your employer to get you fired. I will bury the evidence of your opioid addiction. I will let you keep your perfect career. But if you refuse, I will make sure you never work in forensic accounting again. I will make you destitute." The playback echoed against the stone walls of the estate, wrapping the entire wedding party in the suffocating reality of his malice. Every single guest stood paralyzed, forced to listen to the patriarch of the family actively extorting his own cancer-stricken daughter. The recording continued, amplifying the sheer cruelty in his tone as he threatened to destroy my livelihood simply because I refused to cover up his multi-million-dollar money laundering syndicate. The elite crowd, a collection of Manhattan's wealthiest power brokers and socialites, stared at my father with unmasked revulsion. These were the exact same people who had attended his extravagant charity galas. These were the people who had watched him weep crocodile tears at podiums playing the role of the devastated, supportive father, desperately trying to save his terminally ill child. They had written massive checks to his fraudulent fund based entirely on that carefully curated illusion. Now that illusion shattered into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. The staggering hypocrisy of a man leveraging his daughter's agonizing medical battles and subsequent prescribed pain management as a weapon of blackmail was too vile for even this cynical crowd to process. Judge Marcus Sterling, who had already been on the phone with federal authorities, lowered his device and looked at Richard with a mixture of absolute disgust and professional fury. Several other prominent investors literally turned their backs, refusing to even look in my father's direction. The social execution was instantaneous and absolute. Richard had spent 40 years building an empire on the perception of his impeccable character and unshakable family values. In less than 60 seconds of audio playback, he had been exposed as a monster who would gladly sacrifice his own flesh and blood to save his offshore bank accounts. At the front gate of the venue, a pair of black SUVs abruptly slammed into park. Four men and two women wearing tactical vests bearing the letters FBI swarmed out of the vehicles, moving with coordinated lethal efficiency down the central aisle of the garden. They flanked Donovan first, slapping heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists before he could even attempt to stand up from the grass. The lead agent then turned his attention directly toward the shadows of the oak tree where Richard and I stood. My father took a stumbling step backward. His face lost all remaining color, turning a sickly, translucent shade of gray. His eyes darted wildly across the lawn, searching for a gap in the crowd, a hidden exit, any possible avenue of escape from the federal agents marching toward him. He looked at Chelsea, who was still weeping hysterically amidst the shattered remains of the floral centerpieces. He looked at the disgraced Donovan, who was currently being read his Miranda rights. Finally, his desperate gaze landed on Patricia. My mother had witnessed the entire sequence of events from her position near the VIP tables. She had seen the text messages displaying her complicity in the charity fraud. She had heard her husband's brutal extortion attempt broadcast to their entire social circle. She saw the federal agents closing the perimeter. Patricia possessed an unmatched survival instinct, and she instantly calculated that there was absolutely no social maneuvering or financial bargaining that could salvage this catastrophe. Legal ruin was imminent, and public arrest was seconds away. She needed a diversion, and she needed an immediate evacuation vehicle. Patricia locked eyes with Richard for a fraction of a second, communicating an entire desperate strategy in a single glance. She pressed her hand firmly against her chest, right over her heart. Her face contorted into an exaggerated mask of sheer physical agony. She let out a piercing, theatrical shriek that cut through the murmurs of the stunned guests. "My chest!" Patricia wailed, her voice trembling with manufactured terror. She staggered forward, knocking over a crystal champagne flute, and fell heavily onto the manicured turf. "I cannot breathe. The stress is killing me. My heart is failing." She lay on the grass, gasping dramatically and clutching her pearl necklace. Chelsea shrieked, running to our mother's side and dropping to her knees, screaming for someone to immediately call an ambulance. It was the ultimate pathetic final act of a woman entirely devoid of shame, faking a massive cardiac event to force a medical evacuation and delay her inevitable federal indictment. She would use the flashing red lights of emergency transport vehicles to briefly outrun the pursuing federal authorities. Chelsea threw herself onto the manicured grass beside our mother, her voice tearing through the tense air of the garden. "Someone call an ambulance," she shrieked, cradling Patricia's head in her lap. Her perfectly applied makeup streaked with muddy tears as she rocked our mother back and forth. "My mother is dying. You are all just standing there watching her die." The federal agents who had been marching toward Richard with grim determination instinctively slowed their advance. Protocol dictated that a medical emergency temporarily superseded an arrest. The lead agent pressed two fingers to his earpiece, barking rapid orders to dispatch a medical unit to the estate. The sheer volume of Chelsea's screams forced several lingering guests to take a step back. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me. "You did this, Allison. You caused this heart attack with your vicious lies. You are murdering our mother." I stood perfectly still, watching the melodramatic spectacle unfold, with a profound sense of exhaustion. I did not rush forward to offer assistance. I did not panic or cry out for a defibrillator. I simply crossed my arms over my chest and rolled my eyes. I had seen this exact performance before. It was a perfectly choreographed routine pulled directly from Patricia's playbook of emotional terrorism. 12 years ago, the stage was my high school graduation. I had just been named valedictorian, securing a full academic scholarship to Stanford. It was supposed to be my moment of triumph. But Chelsea, furious that the principal had refused to grant her an entirely fabricated honorary spirit award, threw a massive tantrum in the auditorium lobby. She demanded we leave before my speech. When Richard hesitated, Patricia suddenly clutched her chest, gasped for air, and collapsed against the trophy display case. The paramedics were called. The graduation ceremony was halted. My valedictorian speech was canceled. We spent 6 hours in the emergency room only for the attending physician to diagnose Patricia with mild indigestion. She had weaponized a fake medical crisis to steal my spotlight and appease Chelsea. Now, facing a federal indictment and the absolute destruction of her social standing, she was running the exact same play. "I am a doctor," a calm, authoritative voice echoed over the hysterical sobbing. "Move aside." A tall man with silver hair and a sharply tailored suit pushed his way through the circle of federal agents and paralyzed guests. It was Dr. Julian Vance. He was not just any wedding guest. Dr. Vance was the chief of oncology at Mount Sinai Hospital. He was the man who had overseen my aggressive chemotherapy treatments. He was the physician who had sat by my bedside during my darkest hours, and the same doctor who had repeatedly noted Patricia's suspicious absences during my most critical medical procedures. He had received a wedding invitation purely because Richard thought hosting a prominent chief of medicine would elevate the event's prestige. Richard had no idea that Dr. Vance and I had formed a bond forged in the fires of my survival, or that he despised my parents for their blatant neglect. Chelsea looked up at him, her eyes wide with manufactured terror. "Please save her." "Dr. Vance?" Chelsea pleaded, her voice trembling perfectly on cue. "She is not breathing right. The stress of these horrible lies is stopping her heart." Dr. Vance did not offer her a sympathetic smile. He did not utter a single word of comfort. He dropped to one knee on the damp grass, completely disregarding the dirt staining his expensive trousers. He gently but firmly moved Chelsea's hands away from Patricia's chest. The garden fell into a breathless hush. Even the federal agents paused their perimeter sweep, watching the renowned oncologist work. Dr. Vance pressed 2 fingers against the carotid artery on Patricia's neck. He held them there, his face an unreadable mask of intense medical concentration. He then leaned down, placing his ear near her mouth to monitor her breathing pattern. He pulled a small penlight from his breast pocket, deftly peeling back Patricia's right eyelid to flash the bright beam across her pupil. Patricia remained limp, playing the role of the dying matriarch with absolute commitment. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, erratic gasps. Dr. Vance sat back on his heels. He slowly returned the penlight to his pocket. He looked at Chelsea, then up at the federal agents, and finally at me. He stood up, brushing a blade of grass from his knee. "Her heart rate is completely regular," Dr. Vance announced, his voice projecting clearly across the silent lawn. "Her pulse is strong and steady at 72 beats per minute. Her pupils are perfectly responsive. Her airway is completely unobstructed, and her oxygen saturation appears completely normal." He looked down at the woman lying in the dirt and delivered the final crushing blow. "She is not having a heart attack. She is faking." The words hung in the air, a definitive medical decree that shattered Patricia's last line of defense. The illusion of the tragedy instantly dissolved into pathetic comedy. The guests, who had lingered out of morbid curiosity, let out a collective disgusted scoff. The lead federal agent immediately reached for the handcuffs on his belt, stepping forward with renewed purpose. Hearing the undeniable medical verdict, Patricia realized the charade was over. Patricia's eyes snapped open, blazing with a toxic mixture of humiliation and unadulterated fury. The cold steel of the handcuffs had just brushed her wrists when the sheer reality of her situation breached her towering delusions. She was not going to be transported to a pristine private hospital suite. She was going to be loaded into a federal vehicle and driven to a holding cell. Beside her, Richard felt the heavy grip of the lead agent on his shoulder. For decades, my father had controlled every room he entered through intimidation and wealth. Now stripped of his power and exposed as a criminal extortionist, his primal fight-or-flight response violently activated. With a sudden guttural roar, Richard threw his entire body weight backward. He slammed his elbow directly into the chest of the federal agent, attempting to secure his wrists. The agent stumbled, his boots slipping on the damp grass, momentarily losing his grip. Richard did not hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing Patricia by her designer dress and violently yanked her to her feet. "Run!" he bellowed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He turned toward the DJ booth, where my sister and her disgraced groom were frozen in shock. "Chelsea, Donovan, move right now. We are leaving." It was the most pathetic, undignified spectacle I had witnessed. The four antagonists of my life, the architects of my misery, suddenly morphed into cornered, terrified animals. They did not attempt to maintain their high society composure. They turned and bolted, launching themselves toward the central aisle of the garden. They were attempting to flee a federal raid on foot, surrounded by 200 elite guests who were now actively blocking their path. Richard led the charge, lowering his shoulder and physically shoving his way through the crowd of stunned billionaires and furious philanthropists. He slammed into Arthur Sterling, sending the elderly hedge fund manager stumbling into a table of half-empty champagne flutes. Glass shattered across the stone walkway, but Richard did not look back. Patricia stumbled blindly behind him, her expensive heels snapping off in the mud. She kicked them away, running barefoot across the ruined lawn, her pristine dress tearing on the thorns of the decorative rose bushes. Chelsea and Donovan followed close behind, creating their own wake of destruction. Chelsea shoved her former bridesmaids out of her way, her face contorted in a mask of hysterical blind rage. She was completely oblivious to the federal agents recovering from the initial shock and sprinting after them. She was entirely detached from the reality of the multi-million-dollar wire fraud, the forged medical documents, and the impending prison sentences. Her mind was entirely consumed by the only currency she understood or valued. "I am going to destroy you for this, Allison!" Chelsea shrieked over her shoulder, her voice tearing through the manicured garden as she ran. "You are dead. Do you hear me? I am going to ruin your life on every social media platform in the world. I am going to go live right now and tell everyone you fabricated this entire setup because you are a jealous, psychotic loser. My followers will annihilate you. You will never be able to show your face in public again." I stood perfectly still next to Dr. Vance, watching my sister threaten me with a social media cancellation while actively fleeing from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was a staggering display of cognitive dissonance. When she was 19 and caught stealing thousands of dollars from my college savings account, Patricia had smoothed it over by helping Chelsea launch a lifestyle blog, convincing her that online adoration mattered more than actual morality. They had spent years curating a digital fantasy to mask their real-world toxicity. Even now, facing federal indictments and decades behind bars, Chelsea genuinely believed a well-edited video and a crying filter could reverse a Department of Justice sting operation. She thought internet clout could outrun a grand jury subpoena. Donovan, trailing behind his frantic bride, looked like a man waking up in a nightmare. He knocked over a towering floral archway, the heavy wooden frame crashing down onto the stone path, briefly impeding the agents pursuing them. The four of them scrambled down the long, winding cobblestone driveway that led away from the garden reception and toward the grand entrance of the estate. They were panting, their designer clothes ruined, their reputations permanently incinerated. They had one singular, desperate goal remaining. They needed to reach their vehicle and escape the grounds before the perimeter was fully secured. They burst through the heavy iron gates of the garden, sprinting toward the circular cobblestone driveway where the valet service was stationed. Richard was gasping for air, his face a dangerous shade of crimson. He lunged toward the small wooden podium where a terrified teenage valet attendant was standing wide-eyed, clutching a massive board of hanging car keys. "Give me the keys to the black SUV," Richard roared, slamming his fist down on the wooden podium with enough force to crack the surface. "Do it right now, or I will end your life. Give me my keys." Patricia slammed into the podium beside him, gasping for breath. "Hurry up, you idiot!" she screeched, pounding her fists against the wood. "We are leaving right now. Get the car. Chelsea and Donovan arrived seconds later, Chelsea aggressively shoving the young attendant. Where is our car? She demanded, her voice a shrill, panicked whistle. Bring it around immediately. The young valet attendant did not move to retrieve their vehicle. He slowly shrank back against the brick wall of the estate, his hands trembling violently. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single set of silver keys attached to a heavy leather fob bearing the crest of the luxury dealership. He held the keys up in the air, his eyes wide with fear, and silently pointed a shaking finger down the long, winding cobblestone driveway toward the main road. Following the young attendant's trembling finger, Donovan whipped his head toward the wrought iron gates. The oak trees lining the cobblestone driveway parted to reveal a flatbed tow truck blocking the exit. Strapped securely to the rusted deck was Donovan's prized possession. The matte black luxury SUV, the ultimate symbol of his newfound wealth, was immobilized by thick tension straps. The flashing amber lights cast an eerie glow across the pavement. Donovan let out a primal scream. He shoved past Richard and sprinted down the driveway, his leather shoes slipping on the slick cobblestones. He waved his arms frantically, his face contorted in outrage. "Drop that vehicle right now!" Donovan roared, his voice echoing against the stone walls. "Do not touch that car! Put it down immediately or I will sue you!" The tow truck driver did not flinch. He did not rush to unhook the straps. He calmly stepped down from the cab, his work boots thudding against the asphalt. Reaching into his jacket, he pulled out a folded white document. He stood still, waiting as Donovan closed the distance between them. Donovan arrived at the front bumper, panting heavily, his face flushed with fury. He raised his fist, preparing to launch into another tirade. The driver simply extended his arm, pressing the folded document against Donovan's chest. "Read it and weep, buddy," the driver said, his voice flat. Donovan snatched the paper, his hands shaking as he snapped it open. His eyes darted across the heavy black text stamped at the top. The bold lettering of a federal seizure warrant glared back at him. Signed by a judge, the document authorized the immediate confiscation of the vehicle under criminal asset forfeiture statutes. Donovan stared at the paper, the color draining from his face. "Asset forfeiture, Donovan." My voice cut through the damp evening air, crisp and unwavering. I walked slowly down the cobblestone aisle, my heels clicking methodically against the stone. I maintained a measured pace, watching the complete devastation settle over his features. The federal agents had secured the upper garden and were forming a solid line behind me, slowly marching down the driveway. "That SUV was bought with laundered money," I stated clearly, stopping a few feet away. "You thought you were clever, routing funds through offshore shell companies before making the final wire transfer. You believed layering transactions would hide the origin of the cash. But federal forensic accountants follow the money. Every penny used to purchase that vehicle was stolen directly from the cancer charity. It belongs to the government now." Donovan staggered backward, hitting the grill of the tow truck. He looked up at his vehicle, then back at the paper. The realization that his entire identity was constructed on stolen funds that had just been vaporized finally broke him. He spun around, his frantic gaze landing on Chelsea, who had just jogged down the driveway with Patricia and Richard close behind her. They collided into a panicked cluster near the fountain. They were trapped. The massive tow truck blocked the only exit to the road. The line of federal agents blocked any retreat toward the estate. The towering stone walls flanked them on both sides. They were cornered rats with nowhere left to run, and their survival instinct instantly turned inward. "This is all your fault, you greedy leech!" Donovan screamed, lunging toward Chelsea with terrifying ferocity. "You needed the expensive car. You needed the designer bags. You needed the extravagant wedding to show off to your shallow friends. I told you we were moving too much cash too quickly, but you never stopped demanding more. You dug this grave for us." Chelsea recoiled, her face twisting into a snarl of venom. "Do not you dare blame this on me, you spineless coward," she shrieked, stabbing her finger toward our mother. "It was her idea. She is the one who came up with the fake charity scheme in the first place. She told us how to set up the accounts. She said Allison was too stupid and too sick to ever notice the discrepancies. Patricia gasped, her hands flying to her chest in outrage. "You ungrateful, wretched little girl!" Patricia roared, stepping toward Chelsea with her teeth bared like a cornered predator. "I gave you everything. I built this lifestyle for you. You were nothing before I taught you how to take what you wanted. You spent every single dime I funneled into your accounts, and now you want to throw your own mother under the bus." "Shut up!" Richard bellowed, his voice booming over the chaotic screaming match. "Shut your mouths right now, all of you. You are confessing to federal crimes in front of federal agents." But the patriarch had lost his power. No one listened to Richard anymore. The facade of their impeccable family unity shattered into jagged pieces, replaced by a vicious brawl for survival. Chelsea lunged at Patricia, screaming that our mother had ruined her entire life. Patricia shoved her daughter backward, calling her a worthless parasite. Donovan paced frantically near the tow truck, cursing the day he had met my sister and blaming the family for his impending incarceration. They tore into each other with shocking cruelty. They were entirely oblivious to the federal agents who had now closed the circle around them. The agents did not interrupt the chaotic infighting. They simply stood in a tight formation, letting the four criminals actively destroy each other and verbally confess to their vast conspiracy before officially reading them their rights. I stood silently on the periphery, carefully watching the ugly, chaotic demise of the very people who had mercilessly tortured me for my entire existence. The pristine, untouchable image they had carefully cultivated for several long decades had completely dissolved, finally revealing the selfish, desperate monsters hiding underneath. The towering empire of lies they had built directly on my suffering was burning rapidly to the ground. And they were the very ones eagerly fanning the hot flames. The flashing amber lights of the tow truck cast erratic shadows across the cobblestones, illuminating the absolute collapse of my entire dysfunctional family. The heavily armed federal agents formed an impenetrable ring around the driveway, their tactical boots planted firmly on the pavement. They did not need to draw their weapons or shout commands. The suffocating presence of federal authority was enough to compress the remaining oxygen out of the space. My mother, my father, my sister, and her disgraced groom were trapped inside a shrinking cage of their own design. The chaotic screaming match that had erupted moments ago mutated into something far more dangerous. Survival instinct is a terrifying mechanism, and among the wealthy and corrupt there is absolutely no honor among thieves. Patricia spun sharply away from Chelsea, her chest heaving as she rapidly assessed the steel-faced agents boxing them in. The theatrics of her fake heart attack were completely forgotten now. The carefully maintained facade of the devoted matriarch was gone. Her eyes darted wildly around, calculating the odds, weighing her options, and finding absolutely nothing but dead ends. She looked straight at Richard, the man she had stood beside for 35 years, whose wealth had funded her lavish lifestyle. In that split second, I saw the exact moment Patricia calculated that her loyalty to her husband was worth significantly less than a reduced prison sentence. She raised her trembling hands, palms facing the lead agent, her voice piercing the damp evening air with a frantic pitch. "I want full immunity." Patricia screamed, her voice cracking under the heavy weight of her own treachery. "I will tell you everything. I will give you every single detail of the illegal operation, but you have to promise me full immunity. I am a victim here. He forced me to do it." She threw a violently accusatory finger directly at Richard's chest. "He orchestrated the entire charity fraud perfectly. He told me exactly how to set up the dummy corporations." He was terrifying. Richard's jaw dropped. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. "You lying, venomous snake," he bellowed, taking a menacing step toward her. "We did this together. You spent the money faster than I could launder it. Do not you dare try to pin your unchecked greed on me." Patricia did not back down at all. She leaned in, her eyes wide with true manic desperation, throwing her ultimate weapon into the open air. It was his idea, she shrieked, making sure every federal agent and lingering guest could hear her clearly. "He has been secretly using Allison's social security number to evade taxes for his construction firm for a decade. He set up ghost payrolls using her identity when she was in college. He funneled millions through bank accounts in her name to hide his corporate liabilities. He forged her signature on federal tax returns while she was undergoing chemotherapy. I have the ledgers. I have the physical proof. I will give you everything if you let me walk away. The sheer depravity of the sudden confession rippled through the gathered crowd like a physical shockwave. Gasps echoed from the remaining wedding guests, who had crowded onto the upper terrace to watch the spectacle. I stood frozen on the cold cobblestones, the magnitude of Patricia's admission ringing in my ears. The missing puzzle pieces of my ruined credit score, the inexplicable tax audits in my 20s, and the strange corporate mail I used to receive suddenly snapped into devastating clarity. Richard had actively stolen my financial identity to illegally shield his corrupt construction empire. He had cruelly exploited my battle with cancer as a convenient distraction while he committed massive federal tax fraud in my own name. Richard entirely lost his mind. The public exposure of his most closely guarded destructive secret snapped his final tether to sanity. His face quickly turned a dangerous, mottled purple. "You stupid, worthless, pathetic woman!" He roared, his voice tearing from his throat in a ragged bark. "You just ruined us both!" He lunged forward with terrifying speed. Before any of the federal agents could intervene, Richard raised his hand and struck Patricia across the face. The slap echoed loudly like a gunshot over the driveway. The sheer force of the blow sent Patricia spinning backward. She crashed violently into the side of the tow truck, catching on the metal winch as she crumpled to the pavement, clutching her bleeding lip. The response was instantaneous and violent. The federal agents surged forward, but they were beaten to the punch. Bennett's private security detail, a team of highly trained former military operatives hired to manage the wedding venue, had been holding the perimeter alongside the authorities. Two of Bennett's massive security guards launched themselves at Richard. They hit him with the force of a freight train. Richard was lifted entirely off his feet. The impact drove the air from his lungs in a sharp gasp. They slammed him face first onto the rough cobblestones, pinning his arms viciously behind his back. The sound of his expensive suit jacket tearing was accompanied by the heavy metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists. He lay in the dirt, gasping for breath, completely neutralized. Silence instantly descended upon the driveway. The screaming had stopped. The fighting was over. My mother was sobbing in the dirt by the tow truck tires. My sister and Donovan were huddled together in terrified silence. My father was pinned to the ground by security guards, humiliated and broken. The federal agents secured the perimeter, taking control of the prisoners. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the crushing weight of a lifetime of abuse finally lift from my shoulders. But I was not finished. The financial devastation was complete, but the final personal reckoning was still required. I stepped forward, my heels clicking sharply against the cold cobblestones. The damp night air hung heavy with the scent of pine and ruined prestige. I looked down at my father. Richard lay pinned against the rough driveway by Bennett's massive security guards. His expensive custom-tailored suit was torn at the shoulder, stained with mud and defeat. His face, usually a mask of arrogant invincibility, was pressed awkwardly against the stone, his eyes darting frantically as he struggled for breath. I stopped inches from his face. I held the bright red folder in my hands, feeling the weight of half a decade of silent, meticulous preparation resting between my fingertips. I flipped the heavy cardstock cover open, revealing a thick stack of meticulously organized financial ledgers, bank statements, and federal tax filings. I shifted my gaze to my mother, who was still kneeling by the massive tires of the tow truck, clutching her bleeding lip. Her eyes were wide, waiting for me to process her explosive revelation, perhaps hoping her sudden betrayal of her husband would buy her some twisted form of grace. "I know, Mom," I said, my voice echoing clearly over the hushed whispers of the surrounding federal agents. "I found the tax fraud when I was 28. It is why my credit was completely destroyed and I could not buy a house. I have been feeding the IRS documents for 5 years." The absolute silence that followed was deafening. My words hit the four of them with the force of a physical blow. Patricia's mouth opened and closed in silent horror as she realized her desperate plea for federal immunity was entirely worthless. The government did not need her cooperation. They already possessed everything. They had possessed it for half a decade, delivered directly by the daughter she had spent a lifetime discarding. Richard stopped struggling against the weight of the security guards. He froze his eyes, locking onto the red folder in my hands. The realization of what I had done washed over his features, draining the remaining color from his cheeks. For 10 years, he had operated under the assumption that I was a naive, compliant victim. He had boldly used my social security number to create ghost employees for his construction firm. He had funneled millions of dollars of illicit revenue through accounts secretly opened in my name, deliberately evading federal taxes, while leaving me holding the invisible liabilities. He did this while I was sitting in chemotherapy chairs fighting for my life, convinced I would never uncover the paper trail buried deep within his corporate infrastructure. When I was 28, I attempted to purchase a modest townhouse. The mortgage broker had looked at me with deep pity and handed me a credit report showing massive defaults and staggering tax liens tied directly to my identity. I had walked out of that office in tears, believing my financial life was inexplicably ruined. But I did not simply cry. I dug. I hired a forensic accountant with the small inheritance my grandmother had left me. We traced the fraudulent accounts directly back to Richard's corporate headquarters. Instead of confronting him and allowing him the opportunity to cover his tracks or destroy the evidence, I went straight to the Internal Revenue Service. I became an official federal whistleblower. Over the past 5 years, I had quietly used my occasional visits to my parents' home to access Richard's unlocked home office. I photographed ledgers, memorized passwords, and downloaded encrypted spreadsheets while they were busy fawning over Chelsea in the dining room. Every piece of data was handed directly to a specialized federal task force. "You planned this," Richard wheezed from the ground, his voice barely a rasp. "You planned to destroy your own family." "I did not destroy you, Richard," I replied, staring down at him with absolute detachment. "You destroyed yourself. I merely handed the federal government the shovel you used to dig your own grave. You thought my medical struggles made me weak. You thought my desire for a quiet life made me an easy target. But you vastly underestimated my intelligence and my endurance. I survived cancer. Surviving you was just a matter of basic paperwork." Chelsea let out a loud, shuddering gasp. She looked from me to Richard, her meticulously curated reality violently collapsing. The wealth she had flaunted, the elite status she had weaponized against me her entire life, was all built on a foundation of federal crimes and stolen money. Her designer wardrobe, her luxury vacations, and the massive estate where we currently stood were all subject to immediate asset forfeiture. She possessed absolutely nothing. She was entirely destitute. Donovan, hearing the full scope of the financial devastation, sank to his knees on the cobblestones. The arrogant, posturing groom who had thought he was marrying into a dynasty of untouchable wealth now realized he had legally bound himself to a sinking ship of federal indictments. The millions he thought he could leverage for his own ambitions were already frozen by the authorities. I closed the red folder and turned toward the lead federal agent. He stepped forward, his expression professional and respectful. He reached out and accepted the thick file from my hands. "Thank you for your continued cooperation, Miss Wilson," the agent said loudly enough for my entire family to hear. "The task force appreciates your exceptional diligence. These final ledgers will ensure the asset forfeiture proceeds without any legal delays." I nodded, stepping back to stand beside Dr. Vance. I had done it. I had meticulously dismantled their empire of abuse and corruption without raising my voice or shedding a single tear. I had reclaimed my stolen identity, secured my financial freedom, and ensured they would face the absolute maximum penalties for their unchecked greed. Suddenly, the damp night air vibrated with a low, piercing wail. The sound of multiple heavy sirens blared in the distance, tearing through the quiet tranquility of the upscale neighborhood. The noise grew louder and more aggressive, rapidly approaching the grand entrance of the sprawling estate. Brilliant flashes of alternating red and blue lights began to reflect off the towering wrought iron gates of the venue, casting harsh, sweeping shadows across the terrified faces of my family. The ultimate reckoning had arrived at our doorstep. The wailing sirens morphed from a distant threat into a deafening roar that vibrated through the very pavement beneath my feet. The heavy wrought iron gates of the estate were thrown violently open, scraping against the stone pillars. 5 unmarked black SUVs tore up the winding cobblestone driveway, moving in perfect aggressive synchronization. They were flanked by 3 local police cruisers, their strobing red and blue lights painting the manicured trees in harsh, frantic colors. The vehicles did not slow down to admire the luxury of the venue. They swerved with tactical precision, tires screeching and burning rubber against the stones as they formed a solid, impenetrable barricade across the entire width of the entrance. The blinding glare of their high beams washed over the terrified faces of my family, trapping them like deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. The sheer force of the federal arrival sucked the remaining defiance right out of the damp night air. Doors flew open simultaneously. Heavily armored tactical teams poured out of the vehicles, their boots hitting the ground in a unified, terrifying rhythm. They moved with absolute authority, fanning out across the driveway and securing every possible exit point within seconds. The trap I had spent 5 years carefully constructing had just slammed completely and irrevocably shut. Panic, raw and unfiltered, finally shattered the last remaining shreds of my mother's composure. Patricia scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the rough asphalt. Driven by pure, irrational terror, she abandoned all logic and lunged toward the dense row of decorative rosebushes lining the perimeter wall. She actually believed she could outrun a federal raid in a tattered designer evening gown. She took 3 frantic steps before her expensive towering stiletto heels betrayed her. Her ankle twisted sharply with a sickening crack. Patricia pitched forward, plunging face first into the thorny branches. The sharp thorns tore through her silk dress and scratched her face as she thrashed wildly in the dirt, trapped in the landscaping like a pathetic cornered animal. She lay there sobbing, entirely stripped of the haughty matriarchal dominance she had wielded like a weapon her entire life. A few yards away, my sister's reaction was equally cowardly. Chelsea, the woman who had spent decades pushing me into the shadows, now desperately sought one to hide in. She shrunk back, trembling violently, and physically ducked behind her disgraced groom. She used Donovan as a human shield, her fingers digging into the ruined fabric of his tuxedo jacket. But Donovan offered no protection. The arrogant man who had married into my family for their wealth and status now recognized the absolute finality of the situation. He did not puff out his chest. He did not threaten lawsuits. Donovan simply dropped to his knees on the cold cobblestones, sobbing quietly, and raised both of his hands high into the air in total unconditional surrender. The federal agents wasted absolutely no time. They moved past me in a coordinated wave, their radios crackling with sharp clinical commands. 2 agents hauled Richard up from the ground, ignoring his groans of pain as they secured his handcuffs. The powerful patriarch of the Wilson family, a man who had built an empire on intimidation, fraud, and stolen identities, was reduced to a hunched, defeated prisoner. They dragged him roughly toward the back of the nearest police cruiser, shoving him into the back seat without an ounce of the respect he had always demanded from the world. Another pair of agents marched over to the rosebushes. They did not gently assist my mother. They grabbed Patricia by her arms and hauled her out of the thorns, her dress hanging in ribbons, her face smeared with mud and makeup. She was hyperventilating, begging for a lawyer, pleading with anyone who would listen that she was just an innocent bystander. No one listened. Chelsea and Donovan were separated immediately. An agent forcefully peeled my sister's hands off Donovan's jacket. Chelsea let out a high-pitched shriek, screaming my name, begging me to tell the agents that there had been a massive mistake. I stared back at her with a completely blank expression. She was finally experiencing the exact helplessness she had inflicted upon me for my entire existence. The agents patted them down, recited their Miranda rights with practiced efficiency, and marched them toward separate vehicles. The total domination of the scene was breathtaking. The extravagant wedding reception had been transformed into a fully operational crime scene. The door of the lead command SUV swung open. The blinding headlights silhouetted the tall, broad-shouldered figure of the lead FBI director stepping out into the cool night air. He closed the heavy door with a solid thud and adjusted the lapels of his dark suit. He possessed an air of absolute command, the kind of quiet authority that makes a chaotic room fall completely silent. He began walking down the center of the illuminated driveway. He passed Richard glaring through the cruiser window. He passed Patricia actively fighting the officers trying to secure her inside an SUV. He passed Chelsea and Donovan, who were weeping openly as the reality of federal prison sentences settled over their ruined lives. The director did not spare my family a single glance. They were irrelevant to him, just another set of common criminals successfully processed into the system. He walked with measured, purposeful steps directly toward the spot where I stood, waiting next to Dr. Vance. The flashing blue and red lights washed over us, illuminating the sheer shock freezing the faces of my family members as they watched from their respective police vehicles. The director stopped 2 feet in front of me. He looked at the red folder the other agent had handed him, then looked up, meeting my eyes with deep professional respect. He extended his right hand. I reached out and met his firm grip. "Excellent work, Agent Allison," the director said, his voice echoing clearly across the driveway. The words hung in the chilling night air, freezing the blood in their guilty veins. The undeniable truth finally crashed down upon them without mercy. Agent Allison. The title echoed against the stone walls of the estate. Richard, still pressed against the backseat window of the police cruiser, stopped his frantic thrashing. His eyes widened, bulging against the glass as the reality of my true identity shattered his fragile ego. Patricia ceased her pathetic weeping by the rose bushes, her jaw dropping open in absolute unadulterated horror. They had spent my entire adult life mocking my career. They had relentlessly ridiculed my position as a corporate auditor, calling me a low-level number cruncher who lacked the ambition to succeed in the cutthroat business world. They had completely failed to realize that my auditing credentials were just the surface layer. I was a specialized forensic investigator contracted directly by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, tasked with dismantling high-level financial syndicates. I had spent the last 5 years hiding in plain sight, weaponizing their blatant disregard for me into the perfect cover. I was the invisible daughter, which made me the ultimate federal asset. The FBI director released my hand and turned sharply toward his tactical teams, giving a single decisive nod. The agents immediately descended upon the 4 cornered criminals, pulling laminated cards from their tactical vests. "You have the right to remain silent," the lead agent barked, his voice cutting through the damp evening breeze like a razor. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Richard was forcefully pulled from the cruiser window, his face contorted in a mix of fury and utter defeat. The agent securing him did not mince words. "Richard Sterling, you are formally under arrest for multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, federal tax evasion, and identity theft. You spent the last decade using your daughter and her identity to create ghost employees and funnel illicit construction revenue into offshore accounts. Your construction firm was a glorified money laundering operation." Across the driveway, Patricia was roughly hauled to her feet. The thorns from the rose bushes snagged her ruined designer dress, tearing the expensive fabric into shreds. "Patricia Sterling, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and tax evasion," the agent holding her stated clearly. "You willingly signed those fraudulent corporate tax returns, actively concealed stolen assets, and deliberately orchestrated a fictitious cancer charity to exploit donors." Donovan watched his new parents-in-law being read their rights, his hands still raised high above his head in complete surrender. He was shaking violently, his expensive tailored tuxedo stained with sweat and dirt. An agent grabbed his wrists, forcefully twisting them behind his back. The heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tight, digging into his skin. "Donovan Vance, You are under arrest for grand larceny and corporate embezzlement. The agent read his charges with cold precision. You deliberately abused your financial access to siphon millions of dollars from an established cancer fund. You used those stolen charitable donations to purchase luxury vehicles, secure this extravagant wedding venue, and fund a lifestyle you could never legitimately afford on your own merit. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Donovan let out a pathetic, guttural sob, his legs buckling beneath him. The agent had to physically drag him toward the waiting transport van. He had traded his entire future for a matte black SUV and a superficial wedding, and now he was going to spend the best years of his life wearing a federal prison jumpsuit. Chelsea watched the entire collapse with wild, darting eyes. The golden child, the untouchable princess of the Sterling family, was finally facing the consequences of her own horrific actions. Two female agents flanked her, their grips iron tight on her upper arms. Chelsea let out a piercing, hysterical scream as the cold metal cuffs snapped around her wrists. "Let me go!" she shrieked, kicking her mud-stained heels against the pavement. "I did not do anything. I just wanted a beautiful wedding. You are arresting the wrong person." The agent did not flinch at her theatrics. Chelsea Sterling, you are under arrest for criminal conspiracy, wire fraud, and severe violations of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. You illegally accessed the restricted medical files of your sibling. You exploited her confidential oncology reports to fabricate a false narrative for your fraudulent charity. You weaponized her private battle with cancer to solicit illegal donations across state lines. Your digital footprint is extensive and your guilt is absolute. The mention of her digital footprint completely broke Chelsea. She knew exactly what I had given the authorities. Every text message, every deleted email, every illegal login to the hospital database had been recovered, cataloged, and handed over to the task force. She possessed no defense. The reality of a federal indictment crashed down upon her, crushing her arrogance into dust. She was not going on a luxury honeymoon to the Maldives. She was going to a holding cell. Chelsea suddenly stopped fighting the agents. Her knees gave out and she dropped hard onto the wet cobblestones. The mud ruined the delicate hem of her white bridal gown, soaking through the expensive lace. She looked up at me, her perfect makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. The venomous hatred she had always harbored for me was completely gone, replaced by a pathetic, groveling desperation. "Allison, please!" Chelsea begged, her voice cracking as she sobbed hysterically from the ground. "You have to stop them. Tell them you forgive me. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. We are your blood. We are sisters. You cannot let them do this to me." She strained against the agents, leaning her entire body toward me, her eyes wide with terrifying panic. "Please, Allison, you cannot let them put your pregnant sister in a cage." I stared down at Chelsea, watching the mud seep into the pristine white lace of her designer gown. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and pleading, searching my face for a shred of the compliant, easily manipulated sister she had bullied for 3 decades. She threw the word pregnant at me like a shield, expecting the mere mention of a child to instantly overwrite years of calculated psychological and financial abuse. She actually believed she could use an unborn baby as a get-out-of-jail-free card, just as she had used my cancer diagnosis to fund her extravagant lifestyle. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. My heart, which had ached for their approval during my entire childhood, was completely steady. "Blood is just genetics, Chelsea," I said, my voice cutting through the humid night air with absolute chilling clarity. "You are not my family. You are parasites. You attached yourselves to my pain, drained my resources, and built your fragile little empires on my suffering." Chelsea recoiled as if I had physically struck her. She opened her mouth to argue, to deploy another familiar manipulation tactic, but I did not give her the space to breathe. "Do not dare weaponize your pregnancy against me," I continued, stepping inches from her wet and muddy face. "When I was undergoing chemotherapy, vomiting until my ribs cracked and losing my hair, you were busy logging into my secure patient portal. You took my private agony, repackaged it into a sob story, and used the donations to buy the very shoes you are currently ruining in the mud. You stole my identity while I was fighting for my life." Enjoy the cage, Chelsea. At least you will not have to worry about buying a bigger house anymore. The federal government provides a cot completely free of charge. Chelsea let out a choked, devastated gasp. The two female agents hauled her roughly to her feet. Her legs gave out twice before they managed to drag her toward the waiting transport van. She did not look back at me again. Her golden facade had shattered entirely, leaving behind nothing but the terrifying reality of a federal indictment. Across the driveway, Patricia was still fighting a losing battle against the authorities. She pressed her face against the reinforced glass of the police cruiser, screaming obscenities that were completely muffled by the heavy doors. Her mascara was smeared across her cheeks and her torn gown exposed bleeding scratches from her desperate dive into the rose bushes. I met her frantic gaze through the window and simply turned my back on her. It was the exact same gesture she had given me on my high school graduation day, when she deemed my dress too cheap to be seen with her country club friends. Richard was already sealed inside the lead SUV. He did not scream or fight. He sat rigidly in the back seat, his hands cuffed behind his back, staring straight ahead into the darkness. The man who had demanded total obedience and absolute control over his household was now property of the United States justice system. His construction firm was seized, his assets were frozen, his legacy was permanently eradicated. He had dug his own grave using my social security number, and I had simply handed the FBI the shovel. Donovan was the last to be processed. The agents shoved him into a separate vehicle. He was weeping so violently that he could barely walk, mourning the loss of the millions he had planned to embezzle through my sister. He was a small, greedy man who had hitched his wagon to a sinking ship, and now he was drowning alongside the rest of my treacherous family. The lead tactical agent signaled the perimeter units. The synchronized slam of heavy car doors echoed like gunfire across the cobblestone courtyard. Engines roared to life, a low, powerful rumble that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. The caravan of black SUVs and police cruisers executed a sharp, coordinated turn, tires gripping the wet asphalt as they accelerated out of the estate. The flashing red and blue lights swept across the stone pillars of the main gate one final time before the vehicles disappeared down the winding suburban road. The wailing sirens gradually faded into the distance, growing fainter and fainter until they were entirely swallowed by the quiet hum of the warm evening. I stood motionless in the center of the grand driveway. The cool breeze washed over my face, carrying the crisp scent of rain and damp earth. I took a deep, deliberate breath, filling my lungs completely. For 30 long years, a toxic, suffocating weight had rested heavily on my chest. It was the weight of constant belittlement, the heavy burden of being the designated scapegoat, and the crushing expectation that I would quietly absorb their abuse to maintain the illusion of a perfect family. As the taillights of the federal convoy vanished, that weight lifted entirely. The invisible chains snapped. The shadows they had cast over my entire existence evaporated. I was finally unequivocally free. The massive estate, which just 20 minutes ago had been a monument to their stolen wealth and arrogant vanity, now felt like a blank canvas. I turned away from the empty gates and looked toward the grand entrance of the venue. The remaining wedding guests were clustered on the steps, standing in stunned, absolute silence. They had witnessed the complete dismantling of the Sterling dynasty and the birth of my brand new beginning. I ignored the crowd and locked eyes with Dr. Vance. He stood at the top of the stairs, looking incredibly handsome in his tailored suit, watching me with an expression of profound pride and unwavering support. He knew my secrets. He supported my long game against my abusers. I walked slowly up the cobblestone path toward my groom and my guests, leaving the bitter ghosts of my past permanently in the dirt behind me. I walked up the wide stone steps of the estate, my gaze locked entirely on Bennett. The heavy, oppressive silence that had blanketed the remaining wedding guests finally broke. It started with a single, slow clap from the back row. Then another joined in. Within seconds, the entire courtyard erupted into a deafening standing ovation. The applause washed over me, a sharp contrast to the wailing sirens that had just faded into the night. These were the friends of Bennett, his colleagues, and the few people in my life who had actually known the truth of my existence. They were not clapping for a bride. They were clapping for a survivor who had just orchestrated the ultimate reckoning. I reached the altar and took the hands of Bennett. His grip was warm and grounding. He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners with immense pride. The officiant, a close friend who looked bewildered but determined, cleared his throat and adjusted his microphone. We skipped the traditional readings and went straight to the vows. I looked up at the man who had stood by my hospital bed during the darkest days of my life, the man who had helped me secure the encrypted servers holding the financial crimes of my family. We exchanged our rings, our voices steady and clear in the cool night air. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, Bennett pulled me close and kissed me deeply. The crowd cheered again. The nightmare was over, and the rest of the evening transformed into a genuine celebration of absolute freedom. The following 12 months unfolded with poetic, brutal justice. The federal government moves slowly, but when it finally strikes, it strikes with devastating finality. My testimony, backed by the mountain of forensic accounting data I had meticulously gathered, ensured there were no plea deals and no leniency. Richard and Patricia were convicted of wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. The judge handed down 20-year sentences in federal prison for both of them. All their assets, the sprawling estate, the luxury cars, and the offshore accounts, were seized and liquidated by the authorities. Patricia, the woman who once scoffed at wearing a dress from the previous season, was now wearing a standard-issue khaki jumpsuit, sharing a cramped concrete cell with women who did not care about her country club status. Richard lost his construction empire and his pride reduced to an inmate identification number. Donovan met an equally pathetic fate. Stripped of his professional licenses and disgraced in the financial and medical sectors, he was left entirely destitute. The stolen charitable funds he had tried to leverage were recovered, and the court ordered him to pay massive restitution. He currently lives in a tiny rundown studio apartment, working night shifts at a local distribution center to meet his court-mandated payments. But the most satisfying revelation came during the trial for Chelsea. Her desperate plea to the federal agents about being pregnant turned out to be a complete fabricated lie. Medical examinations at the detention center proved she had never been pregnant at all. She had faked the entire narrative simply to trap Donovan into marriage and secure her access to his supposedly limitless wealth. When Donovan learned the truth during the court proceedings, he visibly recoiled from her. Chelsea is now serving 10 years for conspiracy and severe HIPAA violations. She sits in a federal penitentiary completely stripped of her designer wardrobe and her unearned arrogance, with absolutely no one left to manipulate. While they rotted in cages of their own making, my life blossomed into something beautiful and unburdened. Today, I sit on the expansive wraparound porch of the stunning custom home Bennett and I built together. It sits on 40 acres of pristine, quiet woodland, miles away from the toxic suburban posturing of my past. I hold a glass of expensive red wine in my hand, savoring the complex notes and the absolute tranquility of the evening. The crisp autumn air rustles through the vibrant orange and gold leaves, carrying the scent of pine and fresh rain. My health is the greatest victory of all. My latest oncology scans came back completely clear. I am 100% cancer-free. The physical scars have faded, and the exhaustion that once plagued my bones has vanished. My hair, which I lost entirely during the grueling rounds of chemotherapy, has grown back thick, dark, and beautifully wild, cascading past my shoulders in soft waves. I run my fingers through it, feeling the vital, undeniable proof of my survival. Bennett steps out onto the porch, a warm blanket draped over his arm. He wraps it gently around my shoulders and presses a soft kiss to the top of my head before taking a seat in the wicker chair beside me. Between us rests a small, elegant glass coffee table. On it sits a silver-framed newspaper clipping from the front page of the Financial Times. The bold headline reads, "Sterling Construction Empire Dismantled in Historic Fraud Conviction." I look at the black and white photograph of Richard and Patricia being led out of the federal courthouse in handcuffs. I do not feel anger when I look at the picture anymore. I feel nothing but profound, absolute peace. I take a slow sip of my wine and lean my head against Bennett. I had spent my entire childhood trying to earn a place at their table, begging for scraps of affection from people who viewed me as nothing more than a convenient liability. They had constantly called me weak. They had assumed my quiet nature made me a compliant victim. But they were completely wrong. The sweetest revenge was never about screaming in their faces or stooping to their level of chaotic drama. The ultimate sweetest revenge was simply stepping out of their way, handing the truth to the authorities, and letting them entirely destroy themselves all, while I quietly, meticulously built my own untouchable empire.